In a quiet part of the animal shelter, a sad cat named Charlie kept crying because he missed his owner. His family, heartbroken, had left him there, not knowing how much he was suffering at night. One day, Dr. White was checking Charlie and noticed something strange on his collar. He looked closer to read the tag again, his eyes growing wide. "Oh my God," he said softly, quickly calling his assistant. Emma rushed in. "What is wrong, doctor?" "White?" she asked, looking from him to Charlie, who was still curled up in the corner. "Yes, it is just..." "Are you sure the woman who brought him said his last name was Carter?" Scott asked. Emma frowned. "Yes, she said her name was Grace, and his was Francis." "Why?" Scott hesitated. "Because that is not what is on the tag." Charlie had been inconsolable since arriving at the shelter. Grace Carter, the widow of his late owner, had brought him in, saying he only ever listened to Francis. The family had struggled to care for him and had no choice but to leave him. "If we can, we will come back to get him," Grace had said, dabbing away tears. Scott placed Charlie in a kennel, watching as the cat curled up against the wall, still crying softly. Though grief in animals was not uncommon, Charlie's sorrow was deeper than anything Scott had seen before. "I am going to see Charlie," Scott told Emma later, still thinking about the strange feeling he had. He found Charlie in his kennel, covering his face with his paws. As Scott knelt down, he saw the collar still around Charlie's neck. "It is time to take that off," he said softly, reaching out. However, Charlie suddenly screeched, jumping away and hissing. Scott froze, hands in the air, startled by the reaction. "Why will you not let me take off your collar?" he wondered aloud. He had caught a glimpse of the tag and felt a wave of confusion. "I must have seen it wrong," he told himself, but something felt off. Scott inched closer, his voice soft. "Hey, Charlie, it is okay," he whispered, extending a hand carefully. Charlie's eyes narrowed, and with a swift hiss, he swiped at Scott, claws barely missing. Realizing force would not work, Scott backed away. Frustrated but determined, he left the kennel, considering a new approach. Charlie was not just grieving, he was guarding something. A few minutes later, Scott returned with a treat and a toy. "Let us try this again, buddy," he said gently, placing the treat near the entrance before stepping back. Charlie hesitated, watching Scott, but eventually inched forward, sniffing before taking the treat. Scott remained still, a small smile forming. This was a step forward. As Charlie chewed, Scott spoke gently, telling stories about his own pets. Little by little, Charlie relaxed, his body becoming less tense. Scott tried again, this time with more determination. Charlie was still cautious, but their connection was growing stronger. Using another treat, Scott encouraged Charlie to lift his head just enough to reveal the tag. His heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered. The name engraved on the metal was not what he had expected. It was a revelation that changed everything. "Emma, could you come here, please?" he called, urgency in his voice. She rushed in, sensing the tension. "What is wrong?" she asked, her eyes darting between Scott and Charlie. Scott pointed at the collar. Whatever was written there was about to turn everything upside down. He was trying to put together a mystery that only seemed to grow more complicated. Every new piece of information raised more questions than answers. "Emma, do you know Grace's full name? And are we sure their last name was Carter?" His questions came quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. Emma looked surprised, confusion written all over her face. "I will have to check the paperwork." "Why? What is wrong?" she asked, sensing Scott's urgency. "That name is not on the tag," Scott replied, his voice a mix of doubt and concern. Emma's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Not on the tag? Then who?" She paused, suddenly understanding what it could mean. "I will check right now," she said, quickly turning to leave. Scott refocused on the tag, trying to make out the name etched into the worn metal. It was like trying to read something scratched into an old-school desk, faint and nearly impossible to decipher. Charlie's constant shifting for treats was not helping either, making it even harder to get a clear view. Frustration was setting in. It felt as though the collar held the key to everything, yet it refused to reveal its secret. Emma returned holding a folder. "Yes, they are definitely Carters. Grace Elizabeth Carter Mason and Francis Antonius Carter," she confirmed. Scott's mind reeled. If that was true, then why did the name on the tag not match? It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Nothing made sense. He looked at Charlie, who was curled up protectively around his collar, as if it were his most prized possession. It was clear that taking it away would only distress him further. Scott sighed and decided to leave it alone, closing Charlie's cage carefully. But his mind was not ready to drop the matter. He needed answers. Back at his desk, he took out Charlie's records and began looking through them. Every past visit to the clinic, every little note, and each detail was a clue bringing him closer to the truth. One thing stood out. Charlie had been a patient for 6 years, but he was clearly older than that. He had to be at least 10. Where had he been before? Who had cared for him? And why was his name scratched out on the tag? The next logical step was to visit the Carters' address. Maybe they had the missing piece of the puzzle. Before heading out, Scott stopped to inform Emma and Yara. "I am stepping out for a bit," he told them. "Call me if anything comes up." They nodded, used to his sudden investigative urges. Settling into his car, he punched Grace's address into the GPS. The caller's mystery nagged at him, refusing to leave his thoughts. As the car hummed to life, his mind filled with theories. What if Charlie had been part of something bigger? What if the name on the collar had been erased for a reason? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important to us. Thank you very much. He pressed the accelerator, his curiosity pushing him forward. When he finally reached the Carter mansion, the enormous house towered before him, its silence almost unsettling. Scott parked the car and got out, his heart beating a little faster as he walked toward the heavy front door. He knocked firmly and waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman, someone clearly not Grace. "Hi, I am here about Charlie, Grace's cat. I really need to talk to her," Scott said, hoping she would not find his request too strange. The woman gave him a curious look before responding. "Oh, Mom is not here right now," she said, then added, "but maybe I can help." Scott hesitated for a moment. He had not expected this, but decided to take the chance. "Would you mind if I looked at some old family photo albums? Maybe from around 6 years ago? I am looking for something about Charlie." Jane blinked at the request but did not seem too bothered. "Sure, that is a bit unusual, but let us see what we can find," she said, stepping aside to let him in. As Jane disappeared upstairs to find the albums, Scott stood in the grand entryway, taking in the house's opulent details. Everything about this place spoke of history and wealth, but to Scott, it also seemed to whisper secrets. His eyes drifted to an oil painting on the wall, a formal portrait of Francis Carter. There was something about the way he was painted, almost as if his eyes were following him. Then another photo drew Scott's attention. It was Grace and Francis, smiling warmly, with Charlie sitting between them. The cat looked utterly content in their embrace, and there around his neck was the very same collar. Scott leaned in, narrowing his eyes. The letters on the tag were clearer in the photograph than they had been in real life. He tried to make them out. His pulse quickened. The letters did not match Grace or Francis. The realization sent a fresh wave of confusion through him. Who had Charlie really belonged to? Before he could process it fully, Jane's footsteps echoed down the stairs, breaking the silence. Jane clutched a book tightly, turning to Scott with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked. Scott hesitated, debating how much he should reveal. He considered making something up, but decided to be honest instead. "I am really caught up in Charlie's story, especially after Francis passed," he admitted. Jane's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "My dad found Charlie after he was hit by a car. He was so scared. It took a long time to calm him down," she said, her voice filled with nostalgia. Scott listened closely. "Why did Francis not take him to a vet?" "Oh, he tried, but Charlie panicked every time he got near a car. He would just run off and hide. It was easier to care for him at home," Jane explained. Then she added, "He has been with us for 6 years now." Scott froze. 6 years? That did not fit with what he had assumed about Charlie's past. As they flipped through the album, he noticed Charlie's collar in one of the older photos. Something about it stood out. "Has he always had this collar?" Scott asked. Jane frowned slightly, thinking back. Yeah, he has. Scott's curiosity deepened. Do you remember anyone who might have owned him before? Jane shook her head. No, we never knew where he came from before my dad found him. They continued turning pages until one particular photo caught Scott's attention. It was older, and unlike Charlie's current tag, which was now scratched and worn, the name on this one was still perfectly legible. Scott's heart raced. This was a clue. Can I borrow this? It might help me figure something out, he asked. Jane hesitated for a moment, then nodded, trusting Scott with the photo. Back at the clinic, Scott spread the picture on the counter in front of Emma and Yara. Look at this. Emily Harrington, he pointed out. A quick online search revealed a woman by that name living in a nearby town. The timeline fit perfectly. Yara's expression was tense, her usual calm demeanor replaced with something more urgent. Scott immediately picked up on it. Scott, we have a problem, she said, her voice low but firm. Emily looked up, still cradling Charlie, her heart pounding. What is it? She asked, her mind racing with possibilities. Yara hesitated, glancing at Scott before speaking. Grace Carter is here. She heard about Charlie, and she wants to take him back. A heavy silence filled the room. Emily stiffened, her grip on Charlie tightening instinctively. Scott exhaled sharply, already feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. She gave him up, Emily said, her voice trembling but firm. She left him at the shelter. She did, Yara agreed, but technically, Charlie was never legally adopted by anyone else. Since she was the one who surrendered him, she might still have a claim. Scott ran a hand through his hair. This was exactly the kind of complication he had hoped to avoid. He had seen Emily's reaction, seen the way Charlie melted into her touch. That kind of bond was rare. He also knew that Charlie had been suffering at the shelter, crying, withdrawn, inconsolable. But did Grace have the right to take him back now, after all this time? Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. I need to talk to her, she said. Scott nodded. All right, but let's do this carefully. A few minutes later, they stood in the front office of the clinic. Grace sat in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was lined with stress, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw Charlie in Emily's arms. You found him, Grace breathed, emotion thick in her voice. Emily held Charlie closer, her throat tightening. I never stopped looking for him, she said quietly. Grace's gaze flickered between Emily and the cat, something unreadable in her expression. I did not want to give him up, she admitted. But after Francis died, I could not take care of him properly. It broke my heart, but I thought it was the best thing for him. Now She trailed off, looking away. Scott watched closely, trying to gauge her intentions. Grace, he said gently, Charlie has been through a lot. He has been grieving too. But the moment he saw Emily, something changed. He remembers her. Grace's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to argue. But then her eyes fell on Charlie again. His head was tucked under Emily's chin, his purring steady and deep, the happiest he had been since arriving at the shelter. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. She had loved Charlie. She still did. But love was not always about holding on. It was also about letting go. She exhaled shakily and gave Emily a small, sad smile. He belongs with you. Emily's breath hitched. Are you sure? Grace nodded. Francis would want him to be happy, and he looks happy with you. A rush of relief flooded Emily's chest. Thank you, she whispered. Scott let out a quiet breath, feeling the tension finally ease from the room. Charlie had found his way back home, and this time, it was for good. Scott turned to face her. Grace? His brows furrowed in concern. Yara nodded, glancing between him and Emily. She looks upset. Scott exhaled sharply and exchanged a glance with Emily before giving her a reassuring nod. I'll be right back. Stepping into the lobby, he found Grace Carter standing near the front desk, her hands clasped tightly. Her face, lined with age, carried an expression of grief and uncertainty. For a moment, there was silence. I heard you found a cat, Grace finally said, her voice steady but fragile. Scott nodded. Yes, we did. Grace swallowed hard. Is it Charlie? Emily had followed quietly, standing just behind Scott. As she stepped forward, her gaze met Grace's, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them: recognition, understanding, and shared sorrow. The conversation that followed was not easy. Both women held on to their own pain, their own truths. Emily spoke of the heartbreak of losing Charlie, the countless flyers, the sleepless nights, the hope that had never fully died. Grace listened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse, before finally speaking in a quiet voice. She told of the day her late husband had found Charlie, injured and alone, and how they had nursed him back to health. Over time, he had become part of their family, filling a space in their hearts that they had not realized was empty. The tension between them slowly eased. There was no blame, no anger, only love for the same cat. Their stories wove together in a way neither had expected, forming a bridge of understanding rather than a wall of conflict. After a long pause, Grace exhaled softly. "I suppose he's always had two families, hasn't he?" Emily blinked at her, then slowly nodded. "Yes, I think he has." A quiet understanding settled between them. There was no right or wrong choice, only the decision to do what was best for Charlie. After much thought, they came to an agreement, one that neither had anticipated but both knew was right. Charlie would have two homes, two families, and all the love he had ever known. Scott watched as they reached their decision, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. He had set out to solve a mystery, but in the end, he had helped mend two hearts instead. As for Charlie, he had never been lost. He had simply been loved by more people than he had ever realized. Sometimes love was not about possession. Sometimes it was about sharing,